Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Andrew Gaffney. I'm Editorial Director with Demand Gen Report. Really glad you could join us for today's session. Last month, we did a webinar on memorable marketing. It was one of the most popular sessions that we've done all year. We're going to have a continuation on that theme today, becoming a memorable marketer, where we're going to be looking at 4 key skills to drive buying decisions and really delving more specifically into some of the content impacts in terms of memorable marketing. So we've got a great session planned for you. I want to thank our partner, Corporate Visions, for helping us bring this content to you today. We want to make this session as immersive as possible, so there's a lot of great inspirational content that you'll see. Go ahead and share any comments you have on that over on your social media networks, and we'll be monitoring that. We would ask that you use the hashtag memorable marketing so that we can respond to anything or amplify it. You'll see on your screen here, there's handles for some of the speakers that'll be presenting today if you want to include that in any of your posts. Reminder, today's session is being brought to you by Demand Gen Report. If you're not already a subscriber to Demand Gen Report, we encourage you to take advantage of a complimentary subscription that are available to all marketing executives. You'll get access to great content like today's session. You'll have great access to some of the primary research that we produce and our weekly newsletter. I also encourage you to check out our social media networks. We have a group called Demand Gen Specialists on LinkedIn that has a lot of great conversations going on it as well. Quick reminder, we have our virtual event coming up next month, October 26th to the 28th, our B2B Sales and Marketing Exchange. There'll be a lot of topics like the one we're covering today, a lot of great use case examples, best practices. So I encourage you to take advantage of a registration for that as well. Mark your calendar for that. A couple of quick reminders. Our speaker today, Corporate Vision, does a great job of really involving the audience. So you can type in questions as they come to mind. We'll take a couple of breaks within the presentation where our speaker will take questions live and respond to those. So go ahead and type them in to come to mind. I'll remind you as we get there. There's also a great resource related to today's topic. I encourage you to take advantage of. And then you can also check out other related sessions on this as well. So without further ado, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Leslie Talbot is a Senior VP of Strategic Programs at Corporate Visions. She spent her entire career helping organizations tell better stories to sell more effectively. Consultant, author, and content aficionado, Leslie leads Corporate Visions marketing and sales enablement teams, while also delivering messaging skills training to global B2B marketing organizations. Leslie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to shut off my camera so that we can focus on the screen. But again, thank you, Andrew, and thanks everybody for tuning in. There is nothing that I enjoy more than being able to geek out about marketing with other marketers. And as Andrew said, we do want to keep this session as interactive as possible. So drop your questions into the Q&A as we go, and I'll take some frequent breaks so that we can address those questions as they come up. Okay, so before we begin, I'd like everybody, if you've got a pen and paper handy, I'd like you to jot down a couple of numbers. If you don't have a pen and paper, just hold these 3 numbers in your head. And those numbers are 80, 17, and 5. Now, you're going to hear what they mean in just a second, but 80, 17, and 5, again, just keep those in your head for just a second. All right, so a few years ago, there was a lot of buzz in the market around this new stat that stated that buyers were 57% of the way through the buying process before they ever met with a seller. That number crept up a couple years later to 67%, and it's been edging up more even since then. Today, according to industry experts, 80% of the sales process is now happening in digital or remote settings. And last year, Gartner revealed some research showing that when B2B buyers are considering a purchase, they spend only 17% of their time meeting with potential suppliers. So what that means is that if your prospect is meeting with, say, the typical 3 vendors, you are only getting about 5% of that decision cycle for all of your seller conversations. So buyers are moving in and out of different channels all the time. That's probably not news to you as marketers. The thing is, the buyers just are no longer that interested in interacting with anyone in person. So for those of us who have been around long enough to remember when sales and marketing alignment was a thing, What we're seeing now is more like sales and marketing convergence. It's hard to tell now where marketing ends and sales begins. And if you're a marketer, that has some pretty significant implications for your role. So historically, as a marketer, you've spent most of your time kind of lurking around at the top of the funnel, creating awareness, running campaigns, and those campaigns generate interest. And then there's usually some sort of a handoff to sales, who then drives that customer through to the decision. But like we just saw, digital marketing and new buyer preferences have changed all that. And that is pushing marketing farther down the funnel. So now you've got nurture campaigns to keep lead warms, targeted campaigns to reignite cold leads, and even buyer enablement tools to help customers help themselves during the buying process. And marketing owns all of this. Marketing is also coming to own something else too, a bigger part of the sales process. So whether you're calling them LDRs or BDRs or SDRs or whatever it is that you're calling them, business development functions are now moving over to marketing. And in fact, industry leaders now believe that eventually more than 50% of sales enablement will actually be reporting to marketing. And that means that marketing is now involved all the way down to the point of the decision. And there's a good reason for this, right? Because marketing strength is in creating content and systematizing processes. And those are the two things that you really need to be good at to support a digital buying journey. But there's also more to the story, because there's now a secondary funnel. And that secondary funnel is the expansion funnel. So in addition to taking on more on the acquisition side, marketing is also getting much more involved in customer marketing. That is, expanding business with existing customers. It's marketing that's running the renewal cadences, marketing that's running the upsell cadences, marketing that's creating the QBR decks for sellers, and basically managing all of these programs to ensure they're doing everything they can do to help customers organize themselves to make additional buying decisions. And research shows that the number one factor that drives those decisions is memory. Your marketing touches your buyer in one moment, but they make the decision to buy at a later time. And unfortunately, too much of what marketing creates today is forgettable. And marketing knows this, by the way. So we recently ran an industry survey, and we found that only about 25% of marketers were confident or highly confident that their marketing materials are memorable. So what's going wrong? Why is so much marketing so utterly forgettable? Well, we've identified 4 key areas that are impacting marketing memorability. And it starts with your message. If you're not marketing based on the buyer's specific situation, and you're going to hear more about what that means in just a second, you won't be presenting your message in the right context. So it becomes forgettable to them. If the content that comes out of that message lacks a clear focus and a crisp, well-articulated idea, your audience will not remember what you want them to remember. And if you don't present those offers using crisp, well-designed visuals, your audience will forget to act on them. And without a compelling narrative that speaks to the decision-making part of the brain, your story and your brand get lost in the crowd. Buying decisions happen in the future. So if you're not influencing buyers in the future, you're not influencing those decisions. Okay, so if marketing is driving decisions and memory is the key factor in those decisions, then it stands to reason that as a marketer, you need to make your marketing memorable. That means developing situationally specific messages based on your buyer psychology. It means creating unforgettable content assets that get audiences to focus on what matters. It means designing visuals that persuade buyers to act. And it means building stories that influence memory, decision, and action. Okay, I'm going to take a pause for just a second and see if anybody has any questions so far. Anything in the Q&A?
Yeah, we've already got some good questions coming in, so I'll point a couple your way, Leslie. So one of the questions we had from Sheila was, can you elaborate on some of the latest trends in terms of visual storytelling?
Yeah, so I'm happy to, and you're actually going to see a section of this presentation that's going to focus specifically on visual storytelling. I think the kind of the news or the kind of information coming out of that is that just like you have scientific rules for what makes a great message or what makes a great story, there's actually some universal design principles that you can follow that's going to make your visuals more memorable as well. So later on this presentation, I'm actually going to show you a couple of examples of how that works. So that's an awesome question.
Great. Do you mind taking one more before we move on?
Sure.
From Leo, he asked, are there key questions that you could ask that help to dig in deeper into the customer's decision drivers?
Yeah, absolutely. And so thank you again. So that's an awesome tee up for what this very next section is. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about those questions, and let's talk about what it really means to start with having the right message, because that's where those questions start to survey. Okay, so in our survey, 53% of the respondents to our survey told us that they do not follow any sort of formal methodology for developing messages. Now, 77% told us that having a consistent process is important or very important, but more than half don't have one. So that's a problem, because messages are getting created all over your organization. So marketing is involved in every stage of the buying process now, as you saw, but sales and customer success are still having their own conversations with buyers and with existing customers as well. And everyone's going to bring their own distinct approach to each one of these areas. But unfortunately, those approaches are often separate and distinct and different from one another. So even though each group is supposed to be communicating with the same customers, they're often telling different stories in very different ways. So in a world where marketing is pushing deeper into the sales funnel, you can see how this is going to create a problem. Customers are getting mixed messages all the time, right up to and including the point of decision. And because they get confused and because they're getting so many different messages, they end up oftentimes abandoning the buying process entirely. And the confusion gets even worse when marketing starts running demand gen campaigns to existing customers. So they're out there sending provocative and disruptive messages at the exact same time that sales and customer success are trying to not disrupt, trying to renew that business. So how do you fix that? So creating memorable messages begins with decision science. So what does that mean? That means following the science, not the gut. And it means knowing what questions to ask and what message to deliver based on the buyer's situation, whether they are a new prospect or an existing customer. So here's what I mean by that. So most organizations that we talk to take a one-size-fits-all approach to the way they communicate and articulate value. But the reality is there's actually two major moves that are very distinct in the way that you do that. The first is customer acquisition, and the second is customer expansion. And again, most people think that these are the same moves, one size fits all, but they're not. The science says, and our research has shown, that people frame value and make decisions completely differently between customer acquisition and customer expansion. And we'd argue that there's actually a 180 degrees difference between those two parameters. So your ability to articulate value is directly linked to your understanding and your ability to execute against these two situations. And this is all driven by a piece of science called status quo bias. And status quo bias is essentially this idea that people are reluctant to change their minds. In fact, they'll do everything possible to avoid change. So when you are in a customer acquisition motion, when you're trying to go out and acquire new logos or message to new prospects, the questions that you need to overcome to defeat their status quo bias are questions like, why should they change? Why should they change now? Why should they choose to do business with you? Those are all the questions that you need to ask them and that they need to answer for themselves so that you can defeat their status quo bias and get them to change. But the situation is completely different when you are the status quo, when you're messaging to an existing customer, because now you don't want to defeat the status quo, right? You want to defend the status quo because now you're defending your own business. So in this type of scenario, the questions that you're going to answer, the questions the buyers are going to ask themselves are, why should they stay with you? Why should they renew business? Why should they keep buying the same thing from you? And then why should they evolve, or why should they expand business with you? Again, very different questions, very different psychologies of the buyer. And this is important enough that I'm going to kind of take you through the choreography that you need to follow for each one of these messages, beginning with creating that disruptive why change, why now message. So your why change, why now message begins with creating the case for change. You do this by surfacing what we call an unconsidered need for your audience. Now, an unconsidered need is a problem that is unknown, underappreciated, or unmet in some way. In other words, something that your buyer hasn't thought about or doesn't see coming. Now, I'll tell you, it's really hard to come up with a truly unknown need, something that, that they absolutely didn't know was out there. But if you can find one, run straight to the bank with it, because that is messaging gold. It's more likely that the type of unconsidered need you're going to run across is an underappreciated or an unmet need. In other words, a need that they know about, but they don't think is important enough to solve, or a need that they think they're already solving by using the competition or using some sort of a workaround. So in these cases, it's your job to try to get your audience to care about what you want them to care about, to create their discomfort with their status quo. The next thing that you want to show them is that their current approach for addressing that unconsidered need is flawed in some way. After all, if they're not buying your thing, they must be adopting a flawed approach, right? The trick for marketers is to do this without calling your customer's baby ugly. You don't want to, in your marketing materials, point out how stupid they are for going with the competition or how foolish they were to make their former choices. What you want to be able to do is objectively point out the vulnerabilities that they're exposed to and help them realize for themselves that they might need to do something a little different. At that point, you're in a prime position to show them the new way. So what is it that they need to do differently? Now, again, obviously, what they need to do differently is they need to buy your thing. But the trick in a change message is to avoid pitching a product. What you want to do is recommend an approach, not a solution. Now, it just so happens that the only way that they can fulfill that recommended approach is to buy your solution. But that piece comes later when you actually get around to pitching your capabilities. So that creates the case for change. But you don't just need to generate interest, you also need them to become anxious enough to act. And that's where the why now piece of the message comes in. So you're going to instill urgency by first connecting your unconsidered need to a business issue that is current and relevant in their industry. And then you close your message by demonstrating the impact your recommended change will have in their organization. You can use a customer example or a case study, or just simply share some general likely outcomes that organizations should expect to achieve when they work with you. Just make sure that those outcomes connect back to the business issue you surfaced at the beginning of your message. So that's a change message. But the situation changes radically when you're doing customer marketing and you want them to renew business with you. That is when you want them to buy the same thing from you. In this case, in a why stay message, status quo bias is your best friend. That means that you want to reinforce it instead of disrupt it every step of the way. You do this first and foremost by referencing the progress they've made toward their goals by working with you. So this is where, as a marketer, you might want to work closely with your sellers and your customer success organization, understand what those original goals were, or what are some typical goals that buyers might have when they engage with you. You also want to reference the decision process that they went through to choose you. And you do this for two reasons. First, to reassure them that the decision that they made was wise and well-reasoned. And second, to kind of subtly remind them that it was probably kind of painful and they really don't want to have to go through that process again. So then you want to make change seem unappealing. Not only is it risky and scary, it is also expensive. So even if a competitor seems like it's offering a lower entry price, change always comes with a cost. And your job is to show them that the status quo is way less costly than the cost of change. And then finally, and this is the thing that's a little bit difficult for marketers, especially to wrap their minds around. You need to refrain from introducing any revolutionary, disruptive new capabilities that could prompt your prospect or your customer to want to go out and compare you to other vendors. So you're going to mention your competitive advances, but only to the extent that they put you at parity with the competition. That's because science shows that when everything looks the same to a buyer, their natural inclination is to do nothing, is to stay where they are, which is what you want them to do. Why go through all the pain and cost and hassle of making a change if they're going to end up with something that's just like what they're already getting from you? Now, I know that's counterintuitive, but we've tested this theory time and time again, and the research doesn't lie. Introducing a provocative, disruptive message during a renewal motion will actually decrease the likelihood of renewing by 10%. Now, that's not to say that you don't ever get to talk about your new stuff, but you do that during your regular customer meetings, not at the point where you're discussing the actual contract renewal with them. So if you're like most marketers, you don't just want to get them to stay. You don't want to just keep selling them the same thing. You want them to buy new stuff, shinier stuff, better stuff, different stuff, more stuff from you, right? So in this case, you want them to change, but just not away from you. You want them to change with you. So this is a hybrid between a why change and a why stay message, which is why we call it the why evolve message. In a why evolve message, you begin the same way as you began your stay message by reinforcing their status quo bias and documenting their results. But now you want to introduce a little bit of disruption into their world. You do this by introducing evolving pressures, new threats that didn't exist or weren't on their radar when they first bought from you. And then you need to exhibit a little bit of vulnerability because you are, after all, part of that status quo. But you wouldn't be a good partner if you didn't share the hard truths with them. And the hard truth is they're no longer well positioned to meet these evolving pressures. There is a risk to not changing, but there's also an upside to making that change. And as their trusted partner, who better than you to execute those changes with? So the evolve message is one that relies really heavily on the established relationship that you have with your customer. Even if the relationship hasn't been perfect, there's still an emotional connection and a kind of emotional commitment that they made when they first engaged with you. So it's really important when you're doing these evolve messages to lean into that emotional connection, because our research shows that this is the type of message that resonates most closely with customers. So the advantage to using these types of frameworks, other than the fact that it makes it way easier to create content in a systematic and repeatable and cost-effective way, is that all of these frameworks are based on buyer psychology. And the science doesn't care whether you're a marketer, whether you're a seller, or whether you're in customer success. All it cares about is the buyer situation. So as long as you're using the right framework for that buyer situation, you're automatically speaking with one voice across your entire organization. And that's how you make sure your messages are memorable, by making them relevant and situational. And this is a good time to take a pause for any more questions, Andrew.
Okay, awesome, Leslie. We got a few more good ones come in. We had a question from Taryn. What types of activities are ideal to help with stalled opportunities to get them re-engaged? So not necessarily pure acquisition, not a customer renewal, but something that looked like it was going to close and maybe needs some warming up.
Yeah, so that definitely would still, if you're taking away from a competitor, that would definitely still fall in the change bucket, right? And so some of the types of communications that you might want to do to reignite or reinvigorate a stalled lead would be to share additional information, to resurface those unconsidered needs, depending on what's going on with the market, depending on what's happened. If you've been, kind of trying to entice a new prospect by, sharing an unknown need, you might want to take another look and say, well, maybe there's an unmet need with a competitor that they're currently engaged with that you might be able to go in and you might be able to address that way. Or you might want to surface an underappreciated need at that point, something that they're probably aware of, but they don't care enough about. So you can actually kind of switch up your unconsidered needs and use them in different ways to tweak different parts of the buyer psychology depending on what their situation is. That was a great question.
Great. Can we take one more? Yvonne asked if the metrics that marketing is focusing on should be different in these different kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we'd have to get more specific around what types of metrics that you're talking about. But yeah, I would imagine that you'd want to measure different things, right? Especially if you're talking about measurements between new acquisition opportunity and an existing customer opportunity, right? You want to measure that in different ways because you're moving from, what's a marketing qualified lead, a sales qualified lead in an acquisition scenario to what's a renewal, what's the likelihood of renewal, what's the pace of renewal. So I think that you do want to take a different look at what you track and why you track it.
Great. We have a couple more questions I'll save maybe for later for Leslie. And just a reminder that people go ahead and type in questions as they come to mind.
Okay. All right, great. So thank you. So messaging is great, and I make my living doing messaging, so I love it, but it's not an end in and of itself, right? You don't want to just create a great message and hang it on your wall. You're going to use it to create content and create content assets. And this, again, is where marketers really struggle with memorability. So, I mean, I'm a marketer, you're marketers, we all work really hard on our content assets, and we always want to believe that they have an impact. But in our survey, 87% of the marketers we asked said that they were unsure or do not believe that their audience acts on their content. And they're right. According to the science, an audience after 48 hours will only remember on average about 10% of what you share with them, 10% of your message. And what's worse is that the 10% that they do remember is often completely random. So you can't get people to remember much more than 10%, but what you can do and what you need to do is to make your content memorable is to control what that 10% is. Direct their attention to it and make sure they have that in their memory when it comes time to make a buying decision. So this is just a quick example of how to use that 10% concept in a business presentation. So notice that there's kind of a 10% slide here that's positioned and repeated at different spots in the presentation. Repeating your 10% message helps people remember it. Making it stand out from the surrounding content, making it look different, also makes it more memorable. And in full transparency, what you'll see is that there's a 10% message in this presentation that you're viewing right now. You've already seen it 4 times. Count in your head the number of additional times you're going to see this before the end, and there will be a quiz at the end of this presentation. So, okay, but there are a few other techniques other than the 10% message that you can use to make your content more memorable. And, you know, one easy thing that you can do is to replace all those boring lists and agenda slides that we all know and love and suffer with more concrete action-oriented phrases. So, for example, you see how the list items on the slide on the left have all been rewritten more as and positioned as a reward the buyer will receive for viewing the presentation and what they'll learn as a result of viewing the presentation. So when you win their attention in this way, you're making them work a little bit harder, you're making them anticipate, and this way you also win a place in their memory. And then here's the same concept that's presented in the title slide. Again, there's nothing inaccurate about the title of this slide, right? But again, this new version is promising a reward. It's promising that they're going to learn something different. And in turn, that's going to capture their attention. And when you capture their attention, you drive their memory. So the second skill for a memorable marketer to remember or to master is the ability to create assets that grab your audience's attention, keep them engaged, and stick in their minds long enough to influence their decisions. And I'll pause again and see if there are any more questions in the Q&A.
Yep, I have a few more. Good timing. Let me dig into a couple of these. So Dennis was asking about